We cannot let all of this history be forgotten because we had the best of the best. It was the Dixie spirit. We were all intertwined one way or the other.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a podcast brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation and hosted by noted writer Lyman, who has chronicled the stories, culture, and character of Utah's Dixie for more than 40 years.
It's early June, and that's a pretty special time in Utah's Dixie. It's getting really hot out there. And when school ends and it starts getting really hot, most people who are true Dixieites start thinking about the pool, or they start thinking about their memories of the pool and how you could hop in the car and drive 18 miles or so to Veyo and then jump into the most refreshing water you could ever imagine. And I'm sitting here today in early June with Joann Balen. Joann is the Veyo Pool. For most of us who are still around, we remember her as that amazing girl and lady and woman behind the counter at the Veyo Pool. We also have her daughter, Kim, here with us. And Kim's here mainly to keep Joann in line, I think. But it's really an honor to have you here, Joann, and to be able to talk about this part of our history and the Veyo Pool. And before I turn you loose here, I'm just going to read a little bit because you reminded me the other day about an article I wrote in St. George Magazine. And it's almost 40 years ago that this article was written. And at that time, the headline said, "For 60 years, Veyo Pool has been the place to cool off and live it up in southwestern Utah." And here's to 60 more. We're almost 40 years beyond that headline from all those years ago. And I wanted to share kind of the opening words here. It says, "If those grapevines could only talk, those fluorescent green vines that cling to the steep black rocks above Veyo Pool, they'd tell the stories all right. True tales of Saturday night dances, ninth grade sloughs, blossomed and shattered romances, French fries, pronto pups, and dunkings. So many dunkings. For almost 100 years now, baptism in the waters of Veyo Pool has been a prerequisite to Dixie citizenship. And thank goodness, it's one of the few things in southwestern Utah that hasn't changed." Joann, thanks for being here today. It's just so fun to get to talk to you, and I'd love to have you just share the story with us of how it is that we have the Veyo Pool.
It's really interesting how it all came about. And when I think of my grandfather, James F. Cottam, that was probably one of the hardest pioneers that I have ever known, came to settle Veyo. And in those days, you could settle 160 acres under the Homestead Act. If you could live on it and prove up on it, meaning you could actually sustain life for 3 years, then you could go back to the government and you could get another 160 acres for $1 an acre. So that's why all of the old-timers acquired 320 acres of ground for $160.
And this was in 1915?
This was in 1915 and 1916. And I don't know why he wanted to settle and homestead in a place like everybody said all it was lizards and sagebrush, because he had a college degree and had been offered a position of the superintendent of schools of Clark County. And one of his in-laws, my grandmother's father and uncle, had talked him into coming and settle Veyo. It just so happened that on the piece that he settled, there was this wonderful natural warm spring. And it had been used by the Indians because you could see where they had bricked it up. It just bubbled up out of the black lava rocks. And they had fixed it so that they could put a teepee over it and use it for bathing. And all up and down the canyon, there was remnants of the Indians. And so Grandfather, in 1921, he decided that he would build a pool. Now, why in the world he ever wanted to build a pool, to my recollection, I don't think he ever got in it. But for some reason, he decided to build a pool. It was a bigger undertaking than anyone would have ever thought. And he went to a man by the name of Gardner, and he asked JX, he said, "Will you help me with the engineering?" And JX said, "You might as well pay for your own blunders as mine." He said, "That's whatever you're thinking to do is totally impossible. You do it." So my grandfather had watched the way of the Santa Clara River that ran by, and he realized that when you had the flash floods, he had to have where he was going to put the pool 6 to 8 feet higher than the river. So he proceeded to stack rocks and build a 8-foot retaining wall. And then with a horse and a scraper and a set of work plugs called Chief and Bon, he started to move the dirt a foot at a time with that horse and scraper back and forth. And it was quite an undertaking because the water was a constant flow. It flowed 120 gallons a minute, and it was always in the way, and they had no way to divert it. They did the best they could. But anyway, he finally it took him 3 winters. And then when he finally got it finished, like in 1925, he would let people come to swim if they wanted to swim. And Grandma writes in her history book that the first few swimmers nearly drowned because the women in those days, they didn't want to show their bodies, so they all went in with their heavy dresses and their petticoats. And it was just a small pool, 18 by 24, such a matter. And it was really interesting how they finally did divert the water. Grandma said they crowded the water up over so they could pour the cement floor. I don't know how you crowd water, but Grandma said they crowded it. So I'm just taking her word for it.
So your grandpa he had a vision of something that would be fun and recreational.
But he wasn't a fun guy. When I was a little kid and I wanted to swim, I could swim, and I'd get in there, and he'd walk back and forth like this. And after I was winded, he'd go like that with his thumb, and that meant, "Get out. You've had enough."
What do you think it was that inspired him to do this?
I think that he was a visionary. I think that man had more vision and more ingenuity than any of us could ever imagine, because when he settled on that side, he first was on the west side of Veyo, but somebody moved in. So then he moved over on the side that where we are, and he had no water, and they lived in a dugout while he constructed a flume across that black gorge so that they could have water. And it was muddy water. For years, it was muddy water. Even I can remember the water that we drank, and it was awful. But he had that vision.
Do you think he was thinking in terms mostly of family and friends, or do you think he had a vision of the broader public coming there?
I don't know if he would have ever thought that he would have had big crowds come there. I think it was more for family and friends, and there wasn't really anything to do. Think about it. There wasn't any recreation in those days, and it was such a wonderful warm spring that he must have thought this might be something that people will enjoy.
So talk about that wonderful warm spring, because the water in Veyo Pool is unlike any water I've ever been in my life.
It's magic.
What is the story of that spring?
The spring flowed 120 gallons a minute, and it came out of the ground about 98 degrees, and for swimming it stayed in the 80s. And it had a lot of minerals in it. They always classified it as being a hard water, but yet it was a magic water. When you got out, your skin was soft. It was just some kind of a healing magic water.
And that 120 gallons a minute had been probably
it had been forever.
Centuries. Is it still running?
Well, I think it is still running, but the new owners that have it now have done something a little bit different. And I don't know exactly. I haven't got all the ins and outs of what they've done, but they've done something a little different. But for all the years, for the last 100 years, it has maintained, and we could drain it every night, and it would refill by morning. And so it was always clean. We had to chlorinate it for health purposes. but it was.
Are you aware of other pools like that are natural, that you drain every night and then refill every day?
I don't even think that in some of these places, like in Idaho where they have the warm springs, I'm not sure if people can drain them and refill them. But we did. Every night they'd drain it, hose it down, sprinkle a little bit of chlorine in it, and by the next morning it was full, crystal clear. You could put a dime on the bottom and see if it was heads or tails. It was just absolutely the most magic, beautiful water, and it was a healing water. It must have been for the Indians to have used it all those years.
Were there other springs up and down the creek?
There's one that's further up, and that it's actually warmer, and it was one that the power company used for years, that they would pump it up into the power ditch to keep the power ditch from freezing so that we had electricity.
So this was in the 20s that he developed it. And then by the 30s, it had become a public recreation spot.
1927, he opened it to the public, and it cost 15 cents a day. If you wanted to come and swim, it was 15 cents. He opened it to the public, and then there was not a lot of recreation, and then that turned into the time of the CCC camps. And they needed a place for recreation. At first, out the back, he poured a roller skating rink, and that wasn't near so successful, so he fixed it off a little bit, shined it up, and turned it into a dance floor. And he built an orchestra pit, and they started the Saturday night dances that everybody, your dad said, everybody that was anybody came to the Saturday night dances at the Veyo Pool. 24th and the 4th was the greatest event of all. On the 4th, supposedly, there was a barbecue pit, and they would put a pig in there, and then they'd dance all night and have the barbecue before everybody went home. And they always had a traveling band. Grandma said it was just a traveling band that came and played. And then it evolved, in my time, it evolved to a different era, and it was the Pete Bullock Moose Pace Band. That was legendary. It was a legendary. And my dad had put the wax on that floor until it was so slick you could hardly stand up. And of course, Pete and Moose brought their own refreshments with them, which was a red 2.5-gallon can of Hummingbird, they called it, was made of 100% proof. And the more they drank, the better they played. And people would dance all night long. I can remember the people. I had to call Rosie Cannon to ask her who the fiddle player was. And he was Roy Lobb. And then Bert Emmett played. And it was just the whole canyon rocked. It was just one of the best times ever. And Jerry Iverson reminds me that they would all come and they would get gussied up, and she calls it her veil dance dress. We still use that terminology in our family when we go to shopping, and that one of the kids will say, "Here's a veil dance dress." We said, "Oh, that's what Jerry called them." But the CC camp, when they were there, the girls from Enterprise, Panaca, Pioche, any place they could come from, would get in a cattle truck with the old wood racks, and they would come down to the Veyo Pool to dance all night with the CCC boys. Now, how do you think they looked when they got there?
Oh, my goodness. I can just imagine them coming down into the canyon in the back of that cattle truck. That is a sight to imagine.
A lot of romances were made there. Ed's mother and dad actually met there.
Really? Your husband?
Mother and father met there. He was here with the CC camps, and Leona was from Enterprise, and she's the one that told us a lot of these stories.
I didn't realize that. So Ed's father was here as a CC boy and married a girl.
Enterprise.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and there was a lot of romances, and it's like we've said in here. If those grapevines and those walls could talk, there would be a lot of great stories.
And maybe some that folks might not want repeated.
I told you I wanted to write a book, but I was waiting for some of the people to die before I dared to write it. Even if I changed the names to protect the innocent, they might.
And yet, most of those stories would just be the most wonderful memories that people have in their lives. And I know, as my wife Debbie and I talked about this in the past week, we just have such fond memories of being there, of how it felt to be there. It was special. And those were in the days when we didn't travel and do as many exciting and major things as kids get to do now. But to be able to hop in the car and drive up to Veyo and go to the Veyo Pool, that was the pinnacle of the summer, to be able to do that. And I'm thinking in the times of the 60s is where my most fond memories are. But you started in the 30s, and we could talk about the 40s during the war and after the war, and then the 50s when you as a little girl began to work there. Maybe we could just keep working our way through.
The 50s was the greatest time ever. By the 50s, we had a jukebox. So there was always music and there was always young kids. And I remember my favorite days were when the Cedar Boys came. The Dixie Boys they just didn't quite measure up to those Cedar Boys. There was some good-looking Cedar Boys, and boy, I could hardly wait for the days when those boys had come. But the Cedar Girls they were darling. They were so cute. And it was interesting, the different people that I've met over the years and the families that we've stayed close to and the people that we knew. Because the whole month of April and May, we had school groups. And so Troy Pearson, my son-in-law, tells me about his dad, grew up in Circleville. And they were talking one day, and when Troy was going with Chris Ann, he said, "Where is this girl from?" And he said, "Veyo." And Cordell said, "We went to Veyo Pool on our senior slough," and they lived in Circleville. So it was Panaca, Pioche, Caliandi, Circleville, Tropic, Cedar, all of Washington County. Everybody came for a Veyo Day.
Us St. George, Santa Clara, Washington folks thought it was all ours. But you were sharing it with everybody.
We were sharing it. And there's a crazy thing about all the kids from Pioche and Panaca had silver dollars. And they'd come with a pocket full of silver dollars that had almost pulled their pants down. And by the time they got out of there, they had spent every dime of their silver dollars they'd load up on candy. And of course, we had penny candy, nickel candy. They had to get enough for the ride home, because I would imagine in those days, a couple hours. Would you think a bus ride?
To
Pioche?
Oh, yeah, it would have been a bus.
And Circleville, wouldn't you think 2 to 3 hours?
Or more. 2 to 3 probably, yeah.
Yeah, but those were, and we never had any trouble with any of those groups. They were always so well behaved. I think they must have given them the business on the bus before they turned them off. If you're not nice, you'll be sorry.
Joann, let's go. You've talked about your grandpa, but let's talk about your dad and how that transition occurred. And again, I'm using the word a lot, but your dad, Veyo Cottam, is legendary in many ways. But bring us into his era.
When my dad came back in 1942.
Before the war?
He tried to get into the war. After the war started, he and his brother Garth went to apply to however you do to get into the Army. And my dad couldn't pass the physical because he had varicose veins. So they turned him out. So he and my mother were married in 41. They were living in Salt Lake, and they worked at the Remington Arms plant making ammunition for the war.
And tell us about your mom.
And my mother was from Kentucky. Uh-huh. And she had finished her nurse's training and come to San Jose, California, where my dad happened to be working in a bar because of some deer hunters. That's a whole other era of the deer hunters. And my mother and her friend stopped in at Pete's bar, and my dad bought her a sandwich, and they visited for a few days, and he said, "Will you marry me?" She said, "I'll go back to Kentucky and get me a dress, and I'll meet you in Ogden." After she went back to Kentucky and got ready to get married, she came back to Ogden, and they were married. And then they worked there at Remington Arms Plant because he couldn't go in the war. And a couple of years later, Grandpa James called and asked my dad if he couldn't come back to Veyo because he needed help on the farm and with the pool.
So, Joann, I don't mean to break in here, but you mentioned your Uncle Garth. And in that interim during the war, what happened with him?
Uncle Garth went in to the Army, and he was a bomber pilot, and he was flying a mission over New Guinea, and he was shot down, and his body was never recovered. And he was the first boy in Washington County to be declared missing in the Second World War. And the Hafen boy that we've talked about was the first boy that was killed in action, Keith Hafen. And so that's why the VFW is named Cottam Hafen Post. And it took Grandma 4 years back and forth with the government to determine missing in action that there would be no body. And she kept saying, Grandma always told me till the day she died, she said, I just every day think that maybe he would be a prisoner of war, and someday I would look out and see him walking up the walk like he used to do every day after he'd been out in the field.
Oh, my goodness.
But they never found a body, and one of the fellows that was in the squad with him saw his plane get hit and go down into the oceans.
And just by that fickle nature of fate, Garth went in. Your dad
Stayed back.
Because of varicose veins, stayed back, became who he became, and beloved and known throughout southern Utah. But I think about Keith Hafen and how I know what his dreams and plans were after the war, to be a rancher out in Clover Valley and all of those things. And during that time, so many of those stories are just so profound. And when you stop and think about who went, who didn't go, who died, who didn't die, and then where we are today because of all of them.
And it's really ironic. And I think the ones a lot of times that came back always felt a little guilty that they were spared and their best friends were not. But I know my dad and my grandma was very patriotic, and she always had that dream that her son would come back. And it was about the same time that Aunt Carol, that was my dad's youngest sister, her husband was over in France, and he was shot down and taken in by a French family until they could get him false papers and he could get back to his regiment. So for our family, it was a double-edged sword right there for a few years. And you think about that, and still life had to go on. There still had to be work on the farm that had to be taken care of. There was still the pool to run and build up the business. And so my dad came back, and he and Mother took it over. And there's only two people that I know that loved the Veyo Pool as much as my dad, and that was my dad and myself. Nobody can understand, even to this day. I worry about it. I dream about it. It's still in my heart. It was my family. It was my heritage. And all these years, even after it's been gone out of the family, I still have that love for it. And I know my dad did to the day he died. That was mine and his baby.
Wow.
That Veyo Pool.
Tell us about your dad and his innovations there and how he built on his father's vision and took it to another level.
I think my dad, he loved fun, and he loved people. And if there was anything that he could do to increase the fun, he wanted everybody to have a good time. He was always there. You could still hear his laughter ringing off those black rocks because he loved people and he wanted them to have a good time. He met the ladies at their cars and got their babies out and helped them with their babies. He just wanted everybody to have a good time. He wanted the dances, anything to bring people, and the food had to be just perfect. We raised our own beef and ground the whole thing for hamburgers. We peeled our own potatoes every single day by hand till he got a potato peeler, but that was a nightmare. But anyway, he just wanted people to have a good time.
And that, I think, that really goes to the heart of what that whole experience was, because I remember your dad, I remember you vividly as well, and that same spirit. I remember your dad. I remember his smile. I remember how he interacted with me, made me feel really good. I remember how he seemed to have that sense of pride of we do things well here and we do things right, and we're going to take care of you here.
He just loved people, and he welcomed everybody. And he, like you said, he visited with everybody. You could see him off on one of the green benches, a shade, visit somebody, telling him they always wanted to know the history. I think in his later years, when he started to get Alzheimer's, some of his history got a little mixed up, but it was all right. And people would come and say, did he really do that? And I'd say, if he said he did, I'm sure he did. But he loved it, and everything had to be perfect. His motto was, if you make it good and you're good to people, they'll come back. And the customer's always right. He went by Dick Hammer's motto, you feed it, don't fatten. You give a nice portion, you give them a nice burger, you put your whole heart and soul into it, and you'll always have people come back.
So that brings me to this amazing story of the Pronto Pup. Because if there's anything synonymous with Veyo Pool, it's Pronto Pups. And I can still taste them. And people might these days say, well, was it a corn dog or what? No, it was not a corn dog. But that's probably what people would call it now. And yet, no corn dog has ever tasted like a Pronto Pup.
They were homemade. There's a story to that we always had deer hunters. In those days, my dad always said, you never put all your eggs in one basket. You have to have a lot of different jobs to keep going. You got the farm, you have to sell fruit. Deer season comes, you can get all the California guys here, and you can lodge them and give them a horse and a guide, and you can make a couple $100. You had to have a lot of things to do. And so it was during deer season one year when a man by the name of Don Steves was there, and they had filled the pool up for the hunters to go and have a swim after they'd come down off the mountain. They hunted up to General Steam's, and of course they'd ridden a horse first time all year long, and you can imagine the kinks and the hurts that they would have had. And so they got in that magic water to untangle, and after they had swam, Don Steves went to my dad and he said, you should really build a snack bar here and serve some hot dogs. People love to have a hot dog when they get out of swimming. And my dad thought about it, and so in 1954, I think it was, they built the snack bar. And he and Grace Emmett, we had a lady there from Vail named Grace Emmett, and she was just a most wonderful lady in the whole world, had worked for us for years. And she and my dad came up with a recipe for a Pronto Pup. They didn't want to name it anything but a Pronto Pup. So they invented the recipe and started to sell the Pronto Pups for 25 cents. I can remember the first Pronto Pup that I ever had, and it was, I can still smell it, taste it, see it. It was the most incredible hot dog I had ever eaten, and he sold them for $0.25. But then he made a terrible mistake. He was always so free with his advice, and he always was so kind to people. A man from New York came along. He was on a cross-country trip, and he happened to stop by the Veyo Pool one day, and he had a Pronto Pup. And he asked my dad for the recipe. And, of course, my dad, being the kind of a fellow he was, he gave it to him. A few years later, a fellow called me and said, there's a documentary on the TV, and it's talking about Veyo Pool and the Pronto Pups. And this man had taken that recipe back to Coney Island and patented it. And I always said to my dad, we could have been millionaires. We could have been sitting there getting a nickel a dog instead of us still standing here rolling Pronto Pups for $0.25 apiece. He was so free with what he had, and he just had the personality. He knew everybody, but in those days, we knew everyone. Every single person that walked through there, you knew. If you didn't know who they were when they came, you knew who they were when they left. And then they came back. We had a group of ladies, Barbara Watson, Edna Mae Sampson. Those ladies came every Tuesday an hour early. They came at 9 o'clock because our hours were 10 to 10. They would come at 9 o'clock. And there was, over the years, there was 8 or 10 different ones, and they come in, but it was the same group. And we called it Ladies' Day. And they had salads, didn't want to have French fries because they were all watching their figure. But then on the last day, they'd have French fries with their hamburger. And my dad would always have a bouquet of roses for him on the table. He loved those ladies. He babied those ladies. My mother, it'd make her so mad. He'd go on her rose bush and pick the prettiest roses and stick them in a jar and take them down for those ladies. And, my mother would just say, oh, Melbourne. But that's the kind he was.
You guys lived just at the top of the canyon there as you dropped down in. So your life was just centered around that pool.
It was that was our whole life.
Tell me about your memories of there at the pool and growing up.
I don't remember a day that I wasn't at the Veyo Pool. In all of my growing up years, that was my life. I got up early in the morning, did my chores, and then I went to the pool, and I'd stay all day. We walked down the hill and walked back up, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. And it was a steep walk up, especially in the summer, and we had a couple of resting rocks that we could rest on, catch our air, and then up we'd go. And I don't remember in my early years, we were busy, but as the town grew, our business was, we had as many people that we could possibly take care of. My dad would always comment on some of the busy weekends. He'd say, there's so many people in the pool, they can only get wet on one side.
I got to ask you this before I forget. Did you get in the pool much?
Yes, I got my turn. I did a lot of swimming, and especially a lot of times when it'd get time to close, then we'd get to swim. And my dad, the only time I ever remember my dad ever swimming was on the 4th of July. And some of his friends from St. George had come, Bob Pickett and Nettie had come, and we'd have a 4th of July swim before we opened. That's the only time my dad ever swam, but my mother swam every day. And we always had a little lull about 5 o'clock in the afternoon because we had 2 groups. We had the morning group and then a little lull, and then we'd have the night group from 6 to 10. And Mother would come almost every afternoon, and she and I would swim for an hour or so. And, yeah, we swam. I swam a lot. I love to swim. I've always said, if I get to heaven and there isn't a Veyo Pool, I'm coming back. I've told him at the mortuary, be sure you put my swimming suit in.
Now, Kim has stepped out here for a minute, but maybe we could speak for her because her memories and her feelings are a little bit different.
My girls didn't love the Veyo Pool. To them, the Veyo Pool was hard. It was a hard job. And like she said, everybody said, this is a dream job. You're having so much fun. And she'd think, we're hot. We're back here. Our mother's a slave driver. We have to be here whether we feel good or not. We have to be nice. And you know what? It's a job. It wasn't something that they loved. But the best thing that it did was it taught my girls how to work, and it taught them the importance of an education, that every one of them went on to get a great education.
And Kim's now principal.
She's a principal. She's been principal for years.
Elementary
schools. And yes, they learned how to work. They have a great work ethic.
You did too. And how old were you when you started behind that counter?
Like I said, I bet I must have been maybe 6 or 8. But we had Grace Emmett, and she was getting, so her legs didn't work. So I became her legs. She would point me to what she needed, and I would do it. She would stand at the grill and cook, and I would do all of the other leg work. If I had to do change, we had a little change box, and Grace would tell me how to count it back, how to do the money. But I got the drinks, I got all the stuff, and Grace just stood right there and directed me.
So you were making change at 6, 7, 8 years old?
Really making change. Count it back.
Yeah.
$1.75, $2, $3, $4, $5. Yeah.
Which doesn't happen anymore.
No, we were all old school. We had a pencil and a paper, and my kids were never able to use a calculator. I told them, I said, you use your head. That's what it's for. And we added things up, and that's how we did it. We were old school.
I have such vivid and fond memories of being at the pool, and some of them are when I was really young. Our next-door neighbor, Mabel Holt, would come around, knock on the door and say, we're going to run up to Veyo. Do you want to come? And it was like, okay. And she'd take us up, and we'd swim. in that pool. And just, again, as I've said, that water, I've never felt the equivalent of jumping into the Veyo Pool. There's something
Which is
really,
magic.
really magic about it. And then the smell of the pronto pups, the hamburgers, the French fries, as you mentioned. The French fries, I don't know if I've ever had better French fries.
They were all fresh cut. We got them from Enterprise. That's the Randall family. Were potato growers. And so we had a deal with the Randalls that they would furnish us the potatoes. And at the end of the year, they would have what we call the Randall party. So they would bring all of their employees and their families and whatever. And let me just tell you something. Those Randalls, they could eat. Those kids would come, and it was all on we just kept running bill of everything that there was. And they'd come out and they'd start with a double cheeseburger and a milkshake and a pronto pup and fries. And then they'd wait maybe 15, 20 minutes, let that settle, and then they'd come back for another little treat, maybe another pronto pup. And then they'd swim for a while and back they'd come. I swear some of them could eat 2 or 3 double cheese and 4 or 5 pronto pups. And when they left, I don't know how they ever got home without having an accident. But they loved it, and that's how we paid for our potatoes. It was just a trade-off, and I think we always came out pretty much even. And we just kept track of that, and they came and had a great time, and it was just a fun evening.
There's so much we could talk about, and I wondered, are there any specific memories or feelings that you have, Joann, that you'd like to share?
I think of all of the different people that came through there and the different, I know we had the ladies, I told you, on a Tuesday, and then that evolved into a younger group, the Julie Snow and Kay Peterson and that group, and they had their day and with all their kids. And the Sunday afternoons was just a great day. We'd have the Earl Snow family and the Park Cox family and the Arton family, the Sorensons, and they'd all come early in the afternoon and sit on the green benches while their kids swam. And in those days, everything was on a tab. The kids would run by and say, "Put me on the tab, put me on the tab." And of course, we knew every kid, we knew every name. We just put them on the tab. They'd come up and get a candy, we'd put it on the tab. But those were the days where you knew everybody and you trusted everybody. And it was the friendships that we made. And I think the one thing that I loved the very best was the counter. We solved more of the world's problems at that counter than I think probably maybe even more than Dick's Cafe. And there's something about a bar in the middle and somebody on one side and somebody on the other side. And we had the best conversations, and we always had the lunch crowd, and it would be the old cowboys, Newt Bundy, Bill Mull, Clint Hardman, all those guys, that worked around, and the power company, UP&L. All of their guys had come for lunch, and they'd all pile in there, and everybody knew everybody, and boy, did we ever have the word of the day. You started a conversation, and before long, everybody had an opinion. It was just fantastic of the topics that we could, if anybody would have listened, we could have solved the world's issues.
It would have been great, like we said, those walls could talk, or if we could have just set up a microphone like our podcast here and just be able to listen to those conversations.
And then there was Craig Booth on his motorcycle. And he'd wheel in and park it right outside the door. And then he'd come in and he'd be on his way to Pine Valley. And he'd need to have a cheeseburger with 2 or 3 slices of that good homegrown onion on it. And, oh, you loved Craig Booth because he always had the story of the day, always a delight. But he never stayed long. He was always real busy, you know how Craig always was. And one day, my little Cody was probably maybe 8 or 9, and she was sitting there on the other side of the counter, and he said, "I need to make an order with you." So she grabbed her pencil and paper, and he started to say, "I'll have 30 hamburgers." And she looked at him, he said, "I've got a lot of wives." And he rattled off what he was going to have, and she finally looked at me, and she says, "Mom, is he for real?" I said, "No, he's never been for real." When it was just all the people like that just made your life. Rudyard MacArthur. We still have a saying in our house about Rudyard MacArthur. He and Irma had stopped by on their way to Pine Valley. Rudyard get his hamburger, he'd eat it really fast, and then he'd jump up and he'd say, "Another successful meal. Come on, Irma, let's go." And I'd look down, Irma didn't have hers mashed together yet. Those little things have just stayed with you all your life.
Yeah. Joann, you're talking about people on the other side of the counter. You on your side of the counter are the biggest part of that story in my mind. I know that your father had his role there, but then you carried that to another generation in a way that we treasure. And
thank you.
We just love how you made us feel there, but we also love just that sense of friendship and community and shared, I don't know if it's shared values or just shared appreciation.
Thank you. That is, it was wonderful. We were all, in those days, we were all a family. We all knew each other. We were all close.
But I like how you said that even if you weren't that when you got there, you were when you left.
I can ask a lot of questions really fast. And if somebody came that I wasn't quite sure who they were, now who are you and where'd you come from and how'd you know about this? Before they left, I knew quite a bit. Because that was my job. We worked long hours, and it was hard work, and you'd go home sometimes just so tired that you thought, how will I ever do it tomorrow? But you got up the next day, and my dad would be up to my house early in the morning, and he'd say, every day's a holiday, another day in paradise. And you know what? It was the attitude. It was the attitude that you went to work with. We loved it. We had fun. My kids and I loved to work together, even though they really didn't love it, but they did. We had a lot of fun until the dad showed up. And when Ed showed up, we had to act different. We had to be on our toes. We couldn't play. We couldn't be silly. And so they'd always say, we don't want to work with Dad today. Send him off with these cows.
John, can you maybe just share with us that transition where the ownership changed and just how maybe just give us a sense of where we are now?
It was in 1978, and Ed and I were living in Vegas. We had the two girls, and my dad had sold it to a family by the name of Meeker, but it didn't work out, and he had taken it back, and he called us up one day and he said, you know what? He said, I'm just getting too old. I can't do this anymore. He said, would you kids be interested in coming back? And it was a hard decision because I knew how much work it'd be. And we were in Vegas and we had a good job and we were finally settled. We'd been there about 11 years. But we finally made the decision to come back and take it over. And I really think that was the best decision we ever made. Because we came back and we were able to help with the pool. We started to buy the pool from my dad. And then we built a home, and Ed helped my dad on the farm because my dad was getting a little older and we needed it. And the business was improving. We had as much business as we could take care of because we did everything the hard way. We didn't do things like they do nowadays. I go to a fast food place and see how they do things, and I think, wonder why we didn't think of that. But we did everything the old-fashioned way.
That's why it was so good.
It was all fresh. It was all the old-fashioned way. But I always had good help. I always had older gals that worked with me, my age, whatever. And one of the main ones I can't leave without telling you about, Jackie Drake Hardman. Love that woman. There's never been anybody that could work as hard and talk as fast, besides me, than Jackie. Oh, I love that woman. She'd come to work and I'd say, I don't want to be the boss today. You be the boss. You're going to be the one that takes care. People would bring their kids at 10 o'clock in the morning and dump them off, and they might not come home and get them till 8 or 9 at night, and sometimes I'd take them home. And so we were a babysitter for $1.25 a day. And if they got out of line, I'd say, Jackie, it's your turn. And she had a saying. She'd say, you do that one more time and I'll rip your lips off. And we named her the Ripper. And the kids would come and they'd say, don't mess with those two. That one's the Ripper. And she'll rip your lips off. And, you know, those kids, we never, ever had any trouble, ever. If they were real bad, she'd bench them on the green bench. And they'd have to sit there in the sun for a bit until they could straighten up. And then she'd tell them they could go back. But No, we never had any trouble. We see a lot of those kids still today, and they'll say, "You raised us at Veyo Pool. You didn't put up with any guff." We said, "No, we didn't." But it was, you built that rapport, that relationship with them. They knew you liked them.
As you were sharing that, I'm thinking, okay, so you're running a restaurant, you're running a recreation center, you're running a babysitter service, you're running a swimming pool, which is so complicated. All of those things, you're a janitor, a custodian, how many other things and it must have just been pretty much 24/7.
It was long hours. I always said that I worked 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, from the time before school let out until school started. And then my dad was there at 5 o'clock in the morning. We always drained the pool every night. That was Ed's job. And he'd get the water turned back in by 11:30 or 12. And then my dad would be there at 5 o'clock to start the pumps and hose everything down and start peeling potatoes and mashing the burgers and getting stuff ready. And then I'd show up a couple hours before work and finish with all the prep. And so it was a lot of work. But you know what? I loved it. I loved every minute of it. I made lifelong friends that I have forever and ever. From where did you meet? I stopped by Veyo Pool. It was just a wonderful childhood, a wonderful life.
And Veyo Pool is still there.
It's still there, you know. The day that I sold Veyo Pool, I think that it was like a death. And there was the first year or two after I sold it that I couldn't go there because I was in mourning. I just was heartbroken. But you know how life goes and circumstances come up. My dad was starting in with Alzheimer's, so he couldn't help as much. Ed had his cattle, and he didn't have any interest in the pool. That wasn't his bag. My girls had both gone off to college or married or whatever, and my youngest daughter wasn't old enough yet. And so it left me, and I had to hire 2 or 3 gals, and we needed to make some improvements and things, and life got in the way. It was just time to let it go. And I've regretted it every day of my life because I see now how people run it and how I could have made it easier. But I felt, and my dad felt like, one of us had to be there all the time. Either him or me had to be there. If you weren't there, it wasn't going to work like you wanted it to.
But there must be comfort in knowing that it's still there and still a place that people
and it's still
love and
beautiful.
Enjoy and is really special.
And they've done some real beautiful improvements. It's a lot different than it was, but they still have a lot of people. People enjoy it. The crawdad fishing, all of that stuff, the camping, they've branched out and done more things. And it's just life. Life changes.
Joann, as we've talked here, I just feel like this whole story is indicative of the Dixie spirit. What your grandfather started, how he did it, how he envisioned it, and how your father and how you have made it what it became. There's something special about that. And I know a lot of times it's easy to say we're special here. I think we are, because who else had a Veyo Pool?
Who else had all of the friends that we all had and all of the associations that we all had? Nobody had that opportunity.
Pretty special. Memories keep coming back, and I still remember that 9th grade day, slough day, I guess we called it, and the whole class went from Woodward, went up there, and I can still feel the emotions that I had, all those complicated emotions you have when you're, 14 years old. And I can still remember the music that was playing on the jukebox, blasting on that jukebox. And I can still remember the smell of the Pronto Pups and the taste of the Pronto Pups. I feel blessed that I was a beneficiary of what you and your family created. So for all of us, I want to thank you.
Thank you so much. It was my life. And like I say, it's what made me and molded me. And I loved it. And I have to thank my grandfather for his foresight. Why did he ever want to do that? I'll never know. And my dad for his love and my love. And even though my family didn't love it, They supported me. They worked their little souls out. And the people, the associations, everybody that I got to know from there. I see people and they'll say, we went to Veyo Pool on our senior slough. I love that. I love that when people tell me some of their memories. Oh, we've had a lot of memories, a lot of people. And when we get together, we'll get talking about some of the things that we've done, some of the things that happened, some of the people that came there. And we all get a good laugh out of it. My dad always was looking for another avenue, always. He raised chickens and sold chicken dinners for $1.25 for a half a chicken and all the trimmings. He didn't just stop at one thing. He was always looking for ways. Of course, in those days, everybody was looking for another way to make a living.
Yeah, to make it work. That's part of that Dixie spirit. Our ancestors came here with nothing, and they figured it out.
They did. And like my grandfather came there, why did he want to come and homestead there when he could have been superintendent of schools? They paid $65 a month to be the superintendent of schools of Clark County. Now, why would you come and live on a lizard farm and build a Veyo Pool that took you 3 years to build it? But that's life. That's what they did. And we were the recipients of his hard work and his dedication. I remind my kids often to thank their forefathers, especially James F., for what we have and where we live.
Joann, thank you. This has been a special hour. There's so much we could talk about and so much that I wish we could go into, but this has been really wonderful. And the spirit that you embody is that great Dixie spirit, and it's tied to all of those wonderful memories that we all have of you, your father, and that great place.
You're so kind. And like I said, the article that you wrote back in 1987, you said it all in there. That was a fantastic article, and there's so much history in that. You just have a way with words.
But here we are 40 years later, and we're looking at 100 years of Veyo Pool. Yeah. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think it was in my family for 75 years.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Joann, thank you.
Thank you. Much appreciate it. You know what? You are where you should be, because we cannot let all of this history be forgotten. I've listened to Ed Bowler and all of the podcasts that you've done. We can't let it die, because we had the best of the best. It was the Dixie spirit. We were all intertwined one way or the other. If we weren't related in one way, we were in another.
And you know what? Right now is the best of the best, too. And that's part of what we want to do with this podcast, is for everybody to know how special a place they live, and that these, for them, are the good old days, and they can make them the good old days just like we have those wonderful memories of ours.
Yeah, we do. We have some great memories. And Lyman, you do such a wonderful job in all of the things that you write. I love it. I love to read your stories. I only got the St. George magazine, so the first thing I did was turn to your story. Every book, everything that you've written, I just adore.
Thanks, Joann.
Yep. It's been great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But tribulation.